everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 4th of May, where we are continuing our conversation about poetry. I am in the midst of evaluating your journals, journal number 2, and we'll get that back to you before your second paper is due, which is on drama, and that will be due on the 9th, this Tuesday, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And as we had discussed, our final exam will be posted on the 17th, which is Wednesday at 3:30 p.m. That's the time that our final exam would have been if we were meeting in person. And it will be due 24 hours later. If we were taking the exam in a face-to-face class, you'd have 2 hours. But since this is an online class, I will give you 24 hours. You have up until the 18th at 3:30 p.m. to return that to me via PDF. And the bulk of the exam will be on poetry. So I will be selecting a handful of the poems that we've been discussing and ask you to respond to 2 and to analyze them in depth. And certainly you can utilize things like class notes and also your journals, because you will have, one final journal due, and that will be on the 11th. That'll be journal number 3 on 3 poems. And I should be able to get that back to you before you take your final examination so that you could reference your journal with my comments. Journal being very similar to the previous 2 journals that you've done thus far, in that I'm asking you to respond to 3 poems as opposed to 3 short stories or 3 dramas, and to write approximately a page or so of informal response to each of those. And I evaluate that informally as well, not reading for grammar or mechanics, just for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And I would evaluate that on a checkmark scale. So we were talking a little bit about the 1600s last class and how I tend to be a fan of the 1600s. And I wanted to squeeze in one more poem from the 1600s, the author to her book by Anne Bradstreet. And this was written in 1678. And as you can see in the notes below, I've included the web links for the poetry whenever I could find them online. Many of them come from the Poetry Foundation, which is an excellent resource for finding poetry. One of the reasons why I wanted us is to review this poetry or this poem in particular, is because of the author, Anne Bradstreet, a female author. As we know, this was a very male-centric time period for writing, but that's not to say that women weren't writing, or perhaps I should rephrase that and say that women weren't being published, because this is what we have here. What Anne Bradstreet does is quite interesting. She's got an extended metaphor. So basically, a metaphor is a comparison of 2 dissimilar things without using like or as. If you use like or as, that is a simile. And in this instance, she is comparing writing to the process of birthing and raising a child. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why her poetry was accepted, because she related a task that was associated with female child rearing along with the task that wasn't necessarily associated with female writing. So that connection might have been one of the reasons why audiences were willing to accept her extended metaphor, because of the role of female as child rearer. And there's a good amount of humor in this text, and also some affection, some self-deprecating humor as well. And I always think about this poem at this point of the semester as being particularly appropriate, as you are in the midst of doing your own writing. You may not necessarily be publishing a book, but chances are you've experienced some of the same challenges and some of the same frustrations that Anne Bradstreet is talking about. This is on page 692 of the version of the edition that I had ordered for our class, if you are using the text. And I wanted to read you this poem. You remember I've always talked about the idea of listening to the poem so that you could hear its musicality. The author to her book. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched thence from friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot, still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. And better dressed to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array mongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come. And take thy way where yet thou art not known. For if thy father asks, say thou'st had none. And for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. And you'll notice that they give us a paraphrase here, and they talk about how this extended metaphor likens her book to a child, and that Anne Bradstreet regards her work both critically and affectionately, much like one would regard a child. And that said, if we were to go through this poem line by line, we were to explicate this poem, in other words, try to do a deep analysis, you can see how she is directly addressing the book, but we get that idea from the title as well. This is the author who's talking to her book. Again, the book is likened to a child. Perhaps you could think of this as much like the student to their paper, so to speak, if you are in the midst of writing. And calling that book an ill-formed offspring of feeble brain. So you can see the self-criticism here of feeble brain and the idea that we are basically the parents of our artistic creations, the mothers, if you will, who after birth days by my side remain. And the idea is that a child remains with its mother after birth, and that a piece of writing remains with its mother, its author, after its construction, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true. Eventually others will take your work or your child from you, who thee abroad expose to public view. And again, they'll show this off to the public, whether it be your writing or your child. And of course, judgments will be made, not just about the writing or the child, but about you, because you helped to create it. In fact, you were the creator. Made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not listened, all may judge. That everyone is making judgments based on the flaws and the frailties of the child or the writing. At thy return my blushing was not small. Eventually the child will come back to you. Eventually the writing will come back to you. Perhaps you've given your writing for some editorial commentary, and it comes back to you, let's say, from a teacher with a grade and an evaluation. Same with children. You might send them off to daycare, but eventually they're going to come back to you. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. The idea of a brat, something that's uncontrollable. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. So a mother can find a child annoying and can find a child irksome, and the same could be said for a piece of writing. Yet being my own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. That there is a sense of connection because you are the creator. So therefore, you do want to, at one way or another, improve the child or improve the writing. You feel a certain level of affection or connection. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw. Rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. I don't know if you've ever had the experience with writing where you've tried to revise something and you've made it worse rather than better. And that's exactly what we have here, or the idea of trying to improve the child, but instead what you're doing is making more defects. I stretch thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. There's a little pun going on here because we talk about the metrical foot in poetry, the number of syllables and the beat in the poem. So when you're talking about stretching feet, it's about stretching language so that it fits into the conventions of poetry. And the idea of hobbling, that what you're doing, if you're walking, obviously, and you have to stretch feet, then you're not walking gracefully. The same might be said of the poetry if you're somehow trying to lengthen it or shorten it in order to meet the meter or the beat. And better dress. To trim thee was my mind, but not save homespun cloth in the house I find. The idea of putting the child in better clothing to make a better impression, or putting the writing, let's say, in better formatting, perhaps in nicer fonts or more expensive paper, but that doesn't necessarily change the content. In this array amongst vulgars mayst thou roam. Notice this idea of hobbling and roaming and not being able to control. I've had many times writers say, I know what I want to say, but I just can't say it. So you perhaps understand the sentiment. In critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. Everyone, an outsider, is a critic of the child and how the child has been raised, or the writing and the construction of the writing. If for thy father assayest, thou hast none. For thy mother, she alas is poor. This idea of single parenthood with a child. But also, think about the idea that as a writer, if you are writing the way that one should write, then you are writing in a solitary way. You aren't getting assistance from outsiders. You might get some editorial commentary, but you alone are responsible for the writing. It's singular. And for thy mother she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door, that eventually one must relinquish their child just because of economic concerns. The child is old enough to basically take care of itself. And it's the same with your writing. Eventually you have to release it because you want to perhaps get it published so that you can earn some income if it's a book, or perhaps you want to earn a grade on it so that you can satisfy the requirements for a class. So I think this poem is quite appropriate for an English class as we work on our writing, but also to illustrate that the 1600s had female authors as well, though it was more unusual than not. I think I told you that I teach a women in literature class, summer session 1, and we talk about women writers in the 1800s. And while that was more common, it was still somewhat unusual. The next poem that I wanted us to read was from the 1700s, 1794. Specifically, it's by William Blake, and it's titled The Sick Rose. One of the reasons why I wanted us to talk about this poem is because it is an example of the Romantic poets. This was a very popular style of writing in the 1700s. And the Romantics, it's less about romance and relationship and more about a celebration of nature and the natural world, and the connections with how the natural world could connect with the human world. So some famous Romantic poets that you might have heard of before, Percy Shelley, Keats, John Keats. You might have heard of William Blake before, which happens to be a poet that we happen to be reading. And this particular poem used to be included in your textbook. It no longer is, but you can see, or the earlier editions of your textbook, I should say. But you can see that I gave a link for it. It's a very short poem. And I wanted to read this to you. The Sick Rose by William Blake, 1794. O Rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. And I suspect you understand the meanings of all of the words, yet chances are, after first reading or hearing this poem, you're confused by it. We had talked about that poetry is very dense and compact. It's going to need multiple readings. One of the reasons why I like to talk about this poem is because of the point of the semester that we're in. At this point, we've basically spent a lot of time talking about that we need to read beneath the surface of literature, that we need to look for hidden meanings. But I also wanted to remind you that in addition to finding additional meanings, the obvious meaning also can have validity. And this poem can be read literally, or it can be read figuratively. And it should be read in both ways. That's part of the power of the poem, is that it has a lot of flexibility in how it can be interpreted. So, "O rose, thou art sick" could be in reference to a flower, a rose, like the rose we were talking about that might exist in A Rose for Emily. If we wanted to think about the idea of rose from a symbolic perspective in Rose for Emily, but in this instance, in this poem, this could be a poem written to a literal flower, the rose. "The invisible worm that flies in the night." In other words, pests that basically attack living things. "In the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy." And of course, this is the rose bed, and crimson means red. So the idea is that these are probably red roses. So the rose has been attacked by another life form. It's how our food chain works, that basically one life form exists on a lower level life form. "And his dark secret love does thy life destroy." That yes, the rose is destroyed by the worm, but this allows the worm to continue its life. So it could be that literal, but it can also be very specific or very symbolic as well. So in one suggestion could be that Rose is the name of a woman. "O Rose, thou art sick." The invisible worm. And we've talked before about how worms can be seen as phallic symbols. So perhaps this is a phallus that flies in the night in the howling storm. So if this is an erotic poem, a poem of sexuality oftentimes occurs in the evening. "Has found out thy bed of crimson joy." And again, sex oftentimes happens in beds. And if this were about the loss of virginity, which could be one of the reasons why this life has been destroyed, the loss of virginity for female during this time period. We talked about this as well with Shakespeare, the idea that a woman's worth was based on her virginity. The crimson joy could be perhaps the blood that might have been spilled with the breaking of the hymen and the loss of virginity. That said, it could also be that Rose is a female, but the invisible worm that flies in the night, that phallus, could be in reference to an illicit affair, so the reputation has been destroyed. Or it could be in reference to an unwanted pregnancy, and in that way a life has been destroyed. Or could it be even more general, that the invisible worm just represents disease or decay or corruption in society? And that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this poem, is that you can read it literally, and you should, but you can read it symbolically as well. And that's one of the great things about the Romantic poets, again, is that they would oftentimes make commentary about the natural world, but that would oftentimes also serve as a reflection of the human world. So the third poem that I wanted to talk about today, and this puts us into the 1800s, is from Emily Dickinson. As you know, Emily Dickinson is local from Amherst, and I encourage you to go see the Emily Dickinson Museum in Homestead. And what you can find there is basically a recreation of her home. And Emily Dickinson comes with a lot of folklore. And one of the things about Emily Dickinson, I suppose, or Miss Emily, as she's oftentimes known as, is how she's portrayed in her life. That she was this recluse that basically devoted her life to her art which was true. She did not marry or have children the way she would be expected to do. She came from a rather affluent family. Her father was the town lawyer. So that meant that she was expected to engage in social circles and hold dinner parties, and that's the exact opposite of what she did. And in fact, she defied many of the conventions of her time. She very outwardly indicated that she didn't believe in organized religion, and that while she was quite spiritual, she didn't necessarily believe in religion itself. And keep in mind that religion at the time was not only about faith, but it was also political as well. She wasn't attending church, and that was something that would be quite noticeable during the time period. There are all kinds of stories about her engaging in lots of social relationships through letter writing, but not necessarily having personal interactions. And as much as things change, perhaps they remain the same. I think about the way that we utilize social media in that respect, that we oftentimes don't have personal connections to people, or at least face-to-face connections, because we're writing back and forth. And I can tell you that I wasn't the biggest fan of Emily Dickinson when I was initially introduced to her, but I've come to not only like her, but to love her. And it's not that her poetry has changed, it's that I've changed over the course of time. She tries to express emotional states. This is not an easy thing to do in poetry or in any kind of writing, to give language to a feeling like love or fear or despair. And I think she is one of the best in terms of being able to do that. And I think one of the reasons why I didn't like Emily Dickinson is because I didn't always understand her. And I felt much better after I learned that some of the critics who devoted their lives to studying her didn't necessarily understand her. So that took a bit of the pressure off. And I've oftentimes said that when you're approaching Emily Dickinson, that you don't necessarily want to try to understand every single word in her poem. Sometimes it's just a phrase that has an incredible amount of meaning. She oftentimes has been critiqued for writing about some dark topics, especially death. And yes, she does oftentimes write about death, but death isn't necessarily portrayed as a negative. Death is oftentimes portrayed as a positive, something to be celebrated, because it leads into the afterlife. This shows her spirituality and her belief of the afterlife. And she oftentimes talks from the perspective of death, as if she understands death better than any of us. Perhaps the way that she decided to live her life by isolating herself so that she could observe and comment on the world around her allowed her to have a certain level of perception that she wouldn't have had if she was actively engaging in life, or in the way that we think of active engagement in life. Her poetry is very personal. She oftentimes writes in the I, but it also is universal because the themes that she discusses are themes that we all confront. I think it's one of the reasons why her poetry is so popular. And you should know that she wrote for herself, not necessarily for an audience. All kinds of stories about her putting her poetry together and binding them up in little packets, putting them away in bureaus. The poems weren't even titled. So we refer to the poetry by the first line, or we can also refer to the poems by their particular number if they've been given a numerical order. And that said, she never intended her poetry to be published. After her death, her sister found her poetry, and her sister made it available for publishing. And a terrible thing, in my opinion, and I think in most people's opinions, occurred in that before her poetry, not all of it, just some of it, she wrote many, many poems, over 1,000. But one of the things that happened for the poetry that was published is that it was corrected by editors. Now, if you know anything at all about poetry, you don't change poetry. Poetry can break the grammatical conventions of writing, more so than perhaps any other genre of writing. Specifically, she tended to use irregular capitalization and also tended to use a dash in places where we would normally use a comma. Both the dash and the comma are pauses. The dash is a much longer pause. It might be the dash or the pause that you would take, let's say, before you get to the punchline of a joke in order to emphasize that. So her poetry really wasn't very interesting to many readers or scholars until about the 1950s or so, when an editor by the name of Johnson published her poetry in the way she wrote it, with the irregular capitalization and with the dashes. The dashes, I think, are particularly important. It gives this rawness to it that we don't see, this sense of unconventionality, which makes perfect sense considering the way she lived her life and also the way that she was a female poet in the 1800s. So, as I had indicated, and Dickinson is one of the authors that we review in my Women in Literature class, there were certainly more women writing in the 1800s than in the 1600s and that were being published, but certainly not to the extent of today. So, in many ways, she really was a rebel. And her poetry oftentimes follows the rhythms of church hymnals, which is another subversive act from her because church hymnals are supposed to be reserved for the worship of God. In her mind, the way to worship God was through the worship of nature. This is how she evidenced God. She believed that God couldn't be found in a church or necessarily through human being, but through all of the life in the natural world around us. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of her perspectives. And the poem that I chose, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, is perhaps one of her easier poems to understand. I must admit that's one of the reasons why I had assigned it. But I think it also is very typical of Emily Dickinson. And I wanted to read that to you. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove, at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice and the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And of course, the idea of needing to read a poem multiple times because it's so dense. Notice that this poem is divided up into stanzas, sections. We had talked about how stanzas almost function like paragraphs and that each stanza deals with a specific topic. And if we started at the top, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The idea that death has all the power. We don't decide when to die. Death decides when he's going to take us. Notice how death is capitalized. That personifies death. Death is almost like a kind of enemy. Except in this poem, death is not portrayed as a negative. Death is portrayed as a positive. Because he kindly stopped for me. You don't think of the word kind in reference to death. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. That basically we face death alone. There's a long literary tradition of taking a carriage to signify the journey of life. And that's what they're doing, is they're going through the journey of life to reach the afterlife. We slowly drove. He, in reference to death, knew no haste. There is no time in the afterlife. So time is an earthly construct. So there isn't any need to rush in eternity. I had put away my labor, my leisure too, for his civility. So now death has been called not just kind, but civil. The idea of labor and leisure, those are also earthly constructs, something that wouldn't exist in the afterlife. And you might say that, yes, it would be nice not to have labor, but we want leisure. The reason why we want leisure is because we have labor. Of course, this is a completely different conception of what existence might be like in the afterlife, where we wouldn't have any of these earthly concerns. And then in the third stanza, we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. This stanza basically talks about all of the stages of life. The first stage in childhood, where children would be in school learning, and they're at recess in the ring. In other words, they're playing, and you might be familiar with the children's rhyme, Ring Around the Rosy, Pocket Full of Posy. That's where they would be around the ring, which actually, that rhyme was about the plague and death. Rather dark, actually, when you think about it. But of course, this poem is also about death, but not in a negative way. We pass the fields of gazing grain. So working in the fields would be adulthood, the time of labor. Of course, now we work in offices, but at that time it would not have been unusual to be working the land. We pass the setting sun. The setting sun would represent old age and the ending of life, death. Or rather, he passed us. They are leaving the human realm and they are going into the otherworldly. The dews drew quivering and chill. So now we see a transition here, not just from the earthly world into the spiritual world, but a transition from day to evening. If we talk about the dews drawing, quivering, and chill, there is also a transition in temperature from warm to cold. For only gossamer, my gown. Gossamer is a very thin fabric. It's oftentimes referenced in folklore as having magical qualities, something that fairies would have, like gossamer wings. My tippet, which happens to be a shawl, which they define for you. Only tulle. Tulle is also very thin fabric. It's used for costumes like tutus or used for wedding veils. So again, the idea is that even though it's drawing dark and quivering and chill, this person is wearing very little, very thin fabric. But again, the idea of temperature is an earthly construct. Temperature is irrelevant in the afterlife. So is clothing, in that clothing is worn either because of social convention or for protection against the elements. And again, neither would be necessary in eternity or in the afterlife. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. Notice that house is capitalized here, though Dickinson likes to capitalize many of her nouns. The house was so far away that it looked like a swelling of the ground. So I don't know if you've ever looked at something that seems so far away, it just looked like a little bump in the ground. The roof, in fact, was barely visible. That's how far away it was. The cornice in the ground. It looks as if the roof was in the ground. The cornice happens to be an architectural element that you would find in a roof. So in other words, they're getting further and further away from the human realm and going into the afterlife. What this house could be, as a capital, it could represent the house of worship, a church. It could also represent a tomb or crypt. That would be her new house, so to speak. It could also be the literal house in which she lived in, because there oftentimes is a tradition that before burial, the corpse is driven by or taken by the home of the recently deceased. And then the most important stanza is the last stanza. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet shorter than the day. So basically, all of this happened centuries ago. So this is somebody who's reflecting upon the past. In other words, this poem serves as proof of an afterlife because this person is speaking from the perspective of the afterlife. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. First surmise the horses' heads were toward eternity. And of course, remember that they were in a carriage. So if the carriage is being pulled by horses, of course, she would have had that view. But as I've oftentimes referenced over the course of the semester, knowing one's Bible can be very useful in understanding literature, because in the Bible there is also reference to horses, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that are supposed to bring about basically war and famine, and what ultimately that will result in is the ending of the earthly world and a return to the spiritual for all of us. And the idea here that she's talking about not just her death, but the idea of the death of all of society that will one day come. And those horses' heads are headed towards eternity. because of the horsemen of the apocalypse, as well as the literal horses that were pulling the carriage with death. So you can see that there's some questions at the ending of the poems to help you with your interpretation. So we're asked, why couldn't the speaker stop for death? Again, the idea is that death has all the power. How is death personified in the poem? We talked about the capitalization of the death. How does the speaker respond to death? And we talked about how the speaker referenced death as kind and civil. And why are they accompanied by immortality? Because death brings the afterlife. The significance of the things they pass in the third stanza. We were talking about things like the school, the fields of grain, and the setting sun for representation of the the stages of life before entrance into the afterlife. What is the house in lines 17 through 20? And we talked about some possibilities of that too. So that's it. I had always talked about that you don't necessarily have to understand all of Emily Dickinson's poetry. One of her perhaps most quoted lines, certainly at GCC graduations, is, "I dwell in possibility." And think about the wealth of meaning in just that one line, in those 4 words. And how appropriate it is for graduation, because yes, I mean, schooling and graduations are all about possibilities and hope for the future. But dwelling as in a home, but also dwelling as in obsessing over or thinking about in either a positive or a negative way, or perhaps a combination of the two. Though my favorite line from Dickinson is, "One need not be a house to be haunted. One need not be a house to be haunted." But as you know, I'm interested in Gothic literature and horror films, so I find that line to be quite appropriate. So what I'm going to do is just to leave the poem American Poetry that had been scheduled for today for next class, because I'm cognizant of the time. And we'll do that, as well as The Road Not Taken, very famous poem by Robert Frost. Next to, of course, God, America I by E.E. Cummings. And then we will also talk about Allen Ginsberg. And our class ends on Thursday, actually, on the 11th. So what we've got left is our attendance question for today. So that would be due 48 hours from now, as usual. And of course, if you need an extension, please let me know, and I'll be happy to grant you one. So out of the 3 poems that we studied or we discussed today, the author to her book, The Sick Rose, or Because I Could Not Stop for Death, did you like the most? And why? Again, no right or wrong answer. And you're not required to respond to your peers, but I do ask that you read your peers' responses as well as my responses to them. And of course, all of this can be of use for the final examination, since you will be asked to respond to poetry for the greater part of the final examination. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will continue on with poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.